which is longlisted for 2010 Frank O'Connor Short Story Award, and Beheading the Virgin Mary, published to great acclaim in 2014. He's completed a new book that focuses on a school exchange with Germany in the late 70s, featuring Liam, a character who has been appearing in McLaughlin's work for over 10 years. Roman Simić was born in 1972 in Zadar, Croatia. He's the artistic director for the Festival of the European Short Story and the editor of the series Anthologies of the European Short Story. He has been translated into German, French, Swedish, Slovenian, Polish, Czech, Bulgarian, Lithuanian, Catalan, Slovak, and English.
All lies.
Well, I didn't check, sorry, you know. His publications include the short story collections A Place Where We're Going to Spend the Night, What We Fall in Love With, Feed Me, and A Frame for the Family Lion. Simić's work is marked by expansive run-on lines, putting the reader into the flow of an inner monologue, so that we can't help but identify with the speaker of the story. There's often a simmering intensity to people in the stories. In Objects That Sink, someone is described as having an expression that has been witnessing for the past 30 years or so. Something between the urge to cry, burst out laughing, or detonate a hand grenade, blasting herself, me, and everything within a 50-metre radius. Both authors write deeply interesting characters who have a cynical edge to their outlook. In McLaughlin's story, Five Finger Strand, Desi spent years terrified God would strike him down early, and leave Eileen bring the Williams up on her own. Or that something really awful would happen to one of the 7 on-wee wife of his he carried for him. No matter how much he watched out, waiting for the long pot to boil, nothing ever happened. Instead, his family all turned out lovely, enjoying success after success. So much so that he became convinced God was letting the balloon grow bigger and bigger, just so there'd be a bang the day it did burst. And with that, please welcome Donal McLaughlin.
Thanks, James. It sounds as if you can hear me. The two collections that James mentioned have a zigzag structure, and every second story in each book is part of a loose sequence of Liam stories. Those stories tend to move between Derry and Paisley in the west of Scotland, and the new work that I'm reading from today goes international, as it were, in that Liam is part of a group of school children from Scotland who travelled to Germany, West Germany at the time, in 1978, having hosted their German exchange partners the year before. The two extracts I'm going to read to you are from the second story in this two-story book. So the pupils are now in West Germany. In the first extract, Liam has finally arrived at the home of his host family. They're called Hofbar, and his exchange partner is Udo. I think I need to tell you that in Scotland anyway, when they taught German in schools back then, they used a textbook called Wir lernen Deutsch, which means simply we learn German. I did start off, however, with one called Sprich mal Deutsch, which means let's speak German. But anyone who also did French and saw that mal thought it was an encouragement to speak German badly. And I can assure you we did initially. Okay, so this is Liam arriving at the home of the family. Udo's mother had coffee and cake ready for them, the famous Kaffee und Kuchen. There was bratwurst for lunch first, but Udo's brother was there too. Their dad looked in to say hello, would have his cake later, but had a job to finish before closing time. Fire up, he called it. It was really nice of Udo's mum, Liam realised. Hardly in the door he was, hardly, and already she was laying on all the things he'd said he'd like to try when Udo wrote to ask. What the Hofbauers didn't know was he could go back to the start of Wir lernen Deutsch to try and find some answers. Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, he finally wrote back, so Black Forest Gatto, and Bratwurst and Wiener Schnitzel. All fucking lies it was. He had to write something, but that was the thing about learning languages. You were always having to say things that weren't even true, to show you knew the words, like, could do the grammar. Don't worry if it isn't true, his teachers were always saying, in French and all. He felt lousy about Liam. Here was Udo's mum going to all this bother, and he'd been lying through his teeth to her. His conscience must have been bothering him right enough, because Danke, Frau Hofbar, he was saying next, pointing to the spread she'd laid on. Es ist gut, sehr gut. Es schmeckt. It was all really tasty, in other words. That bit at least was true. The next bit was totally confusing. Udo's mother was trying to explain that he could have schnitzel, the third thing he wanted to try that evening. The word locale kept coming up, but like it was local schnitzel. Realising he wasn't understanding something maybe, he used one of the phrases taught for when you were stuck. It was only when Udo mentioned a cafe or restaurant, the same words pronounced the German way, but that he cottoned on. They'd be eating out, and there was really good schnitzel in the locale they were going to. Other than that, he was managing fine with the German leg. He just got Udo to repeat things, if need be, sometimes. It was like he was more used to Udo's voice, could understand Udo when he said things, whereas his mother or brother could say the same thing, and he wouldn't quite catch it, because of their accent or voices like. Thank fucking God, he thought, for expressions like, kannst du bitte langsamer sprechen? Can you speak more slowly? Kannst du bitte deutlicher sprechen? Can you speak more clearly? Kannst du es anders ausdrücken? Can you say it in a different way? The last sportful of Black Forest was hardly in his mouth hardly, before the woman was offering him more, or a piece of Erdbeertorte, when he said no thanks. Erdbeertorte was flan, a strawberry flan, said she bought the whole thing from the bakery in the village, and not done what his mum would do, buy the base from a shop just, and slap fruit and jelly on top. Liam was so full he'd forced himself to take a bit, that then took ages to eat. That was nothing but forcing down a second bit like. No, you, Udo's brother, was soon on to his 8th piece of flan, then had a slice of gateau to round things off. God knows where the young fellow put it, fading away to an elephant he should have been, thin as a bucking rake, but he was. Even if Udo had to help him at times, they kept going back to Liam's German, to how good his German was. Udo had let his mum see his letters, and she went on and on about him never making mistakes. Hilarious it was, how at the end of every letter he wrote, Entschuldige meine Fehler bitte, or hab bitte Verständnis für etwaige Fehler. There were no mistakes to forgive, but she fetched the most recent one, with a list of things he wanted to try, and Liam spotted something he'd forgot, the coins at the bottom of the page he drew one night. He'd been out of nice notepaper, so done something as grand as Plosky had shown him, slipped a coin under the page and scored all over it in pencil. The one with all the hands it was, the 50p with the hands, the one for the common market lick, to mark Britain joining. It looked quite good if he said so himself. He hadn't lent too heavy or lent too light on the pencil lick. Too heavy and it would look too brutal. Too light and you couldn't make it out. He was still minding doing it when Frau Hofbar spoke to him again. It wasn't like Englander to learn languages, she said. Liam, of course, picked up on that Englander. Udo but was faster, got in there first. Liam wasn't English, he minded his mother. He was born in Ireland and lived in Scotland. Liam saw his chance and pounced. Word Schottland was hardly out of Udo's mouth when he announced, Und England ist eine Halbinsel an der Südküste Schottlands. Frau Hofbar choked on a Black Forest cherry nearly. She had not seen that one coming. His claiming England was a peninsula just on the south coast of Scotland. He really was an exception, eine Ausnahme, she told him, which was a compliment in itself. It got better, but the locals, she went on, thought Englander were Inselaffen. Inselaffen. was the first time he was hearing it. Liam loved the word immediately. Insel bucking affen. He might not have known what the English for it was. He knew right away but what it meant. Had a wee cartoon in his head even. Insel was island, and affen were monkeys or apes. And insel affen, from what Odo's mother was saying, were ones who couldn't see past their own wee island, were too bucking blanker, had no interest at all in anywhere else. They never travelled, couldn't see past where they came from. A bit like Derry people when it came to Derry, Liam was thinking, when suddenly she declared, "Und du bist kein Inselaffe, Liam." Phew, thank Christ for that. She didn't think he was one. It was a compliment meant to be. He was struggling to accept it, but this was his first time, sure, his first time abroad. He decided to be honest and admitted, "Aber ich bin zum ersten Mal im Ausland." Maybe so, came the reply, but he was here and would come again and was learning German and French, and from what Udo told her, had done some Italian even, and started reading books in other languages. He gave in, conceded defeatedly. "Okay, ich bin kein Inselaffe," he said, minded to say kein for once, and not nicht ein. It was amazing. It had never entered his head before, and it wasn't as if there was a word for it in English necessarily even. Now but, Udo's mother had made him realise he wasn't an Inselaffe, and no bucking way would he ever want to be one. He'd always be interested in other places, sure, would want to get some Außenluft, the other thing she kept mentioning. Außenluft, however you translate that, like outside air, so the air elsewhere, or air from elsewhere, maybe high. Frau Hofbauer went back to her work, and him and Harry and Odo moved over to the comfy seats, the Sitzgruppe, as they called it. "You've made a good impression," they tell Liam. "Mutti mag dich." Their mum liked him. So that's the first of the two extracts. I feel the need to dedicate it to Boris Johnson for some reason. I can't tell you how peeved off I am by all that's going on in that respect. Okay, the second extract sees the group still in Germany. Having spent a weekend or so with the host families, they go off to Berlin, which involves driving by bus from West Germany into East Germany to West Berlin. So there's this whole trip through what used to be the German Democratic Republic to get there. They've been in Berlin, West Berlin, for a couple of days. To enter the East, as you might know, you had to go in through checkpoint Charlie. You also had to leave at that checkpoint. While they're waiting, I won't read this bit, but while they're waiting, two boys sneak off the bus, go up to the Berlin Wall, give it a kick, it crumbles, they collect their souvenirs and share them out in the bus. This actually happened in 1978 when we were there. And this is the point where I start reading. They got in, were allowed in all right. Bits of the wall in their pockets or not, they were let in. Liam was just glad no one thought to insist they empty their pockets. They could have been taken for bucking stone throwers, sure. That was him thinking of Derry, maybe just, but of the stone throwing outside his grands, wee boys and young fellas attacking the army like. The Scottish young fellas wouldn't be thinking like that. East German guards wouldn't be either. Not that they'd have been over the moon like to discover the wall had been vandalised. Bus pulled forward anyway, and a woman with fair hair got on, her hair up in a ponytail, pulled back tight. A thrill went through the bus, the Scottish seats at least. The woman was their guide, didn't speak English but, or so she claimed. The advisor anyhow said he'd translate whatever she said like. She'd kindly agreed he could translate whatever she had to tell them. They drove straight ahead for a bit, then turned left. This was Unter den Linden, she said, the famous street named after its lime trees. Straight ahead was the Brandenburg Gate. It was mad seeing it now from the front, not from behind with the wall blocking your view. To the left was the Russian embassy with Lenin's head in the garden. The driver slowed to let them take snaps. It was awkward, but no matter where they sat, taking their snaps from the bus like. One or two asked could they get off for a minute just even. They weren't allowed but, or there wasn't time. Maybe because of the delay at checkpoint Charlie. Your woman wasn't one bit bucking happy about them being late, that was for sure. She pointed other stuff out as they drove down Unter den Linden, past where they first pulled onto it and all. The Humboldt University on the left, the opera on the right. Further down, the Palace of the Republic, with the Volkskammer, the East German Parliament in it. The cathedral opposite on Museum Island, other museums in behind it. The Red Town Hall, Alexanderplatz, the TV tower. You had to hand it to him. The advisor was playing a blinder. No matter what your woman came out with, he was putting it into English, minding all the names too. He wasn't taking notes either, was doing it all from memory. I want to do that one day, Liam thought. It gave him a real buzz, the thought of it even just, of having to come up with the English every time. Fair play to the advisor. It wasn't getting any easier, so it wasn't. Your woman had moved on from talking about the sights to talking about what she was always calling our country or our state. In our country, there was no unemployment, she said. In our country, there was no drugs problem. In our country, there was no racism. And in our country, there was no prostitution. In our state, there was none of the problems whatsoever, she insisted, over and over and over again. She went on and on so bloody much, you'd have thought the needle was stuck. Ended up wondering, had they problems maybe after all? Was there problems in their country after all? The words antifascistisch and sozialistisch kept coming up. No matter what she talked about, it was antifascistisch this, sozialistisch that. Got to the point a whole lot of them glazed over, blotted her out just. They were more interested in what they could see out the bus windows like, the cars, the Trabants especially. They were clocking what the East Germans wore and all. There was no jeans, no Wranglers or Levi's anyhow, and grey, a lot of grey, and East German grey, Ostgrau. They'd have stood out a mile if they had been let off. Their own clothes were so bucking different, and that was before they pulled their bananas out, the banana that was part of their lunch like. There was so much space in East Berlin. It was so quiet, was what Liam noticed. He preferred it to the west nearly, if he thought about the Kudamm, the crowds along the Kudamm, or all the hustle and bustle at Zoo Station. He hates it, the young fellow, when you can't hear your ears shut. At some point, the bus started moving again. After a fair bit of driving a bit and stopping, it was fairly moving, finally motoring more. They were going to Treptow, your woman explained, to visit the Soviet memorial. There, they did get off the bus, maybe because there was no one around hardly. Place was deserted, practically. It was the Russians who liberated Berlin, she minded them now, not the English and not the Americans. It was the Russians who fought here and won the battle for Berlin. There was a huge big statue she pointed to of a Russian crushing a swastika. 5,000 of the Russians who died were buried here, she told them, beneath the 2 lines of gravestones they could see in front of them, laid out flat in front of them on the ground like. They were allowed to take snaps, and take them they did, of the 2 huge big Soviet flags made of red granite, of the 2 kneeling soldiers, and of the statue of Motherland weeping for her sons. It wasn't exactly art, so it wasn't, and their snaps mightn't turn out. You had to feel for the men that fell, but could only buck and feel for the ones who fell. They were allowed to walk all around it. On the way back to Checkpoint Charlie, your woman asked had they any questions. Sammy Simpson put his hand up. Yeah, she said. If Arthur Ulbricht said no one had any intention of building a wall, says he, why was a wall built? He was thinking of the famous postcards, Sammy, they'd all bought already, with Ulbricht's famous coat like, and a picture of East German soldiers laying the first bricks. Your woman didn't answer him high. She understood rightly, probably, refused to answer him back, said any questions would have to be in German. The advisor offered to translate again. Suddenly she wasn't having it back. If anyone had a question, they'd to ask it in German, themselves back. If they wanted an answer, they should show her that respect. It must have been them words, respect side, that done it. Because where you might have expected a teacher to speak up next, or one of the German group, here it was our Liam who put his hand up. Walter Ulbricht hat gesagt, says he, minding the words on the postcard. Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer zu errichten. Warum also hat man eine Mauer errichtet? Exact same question, in other words, that Sammy asked, said in German. Your woman was fucking fuming, they could tell. He might have got all his endings right and the verbs in the right place, Liam. You could tell, but the advisor wished and all he kept his mouth shut. Written all over the boy it was. Wasn't as if the young fella listened to the answer either. Anti-fascist this, socialist that. He was still too annoyed, sure, at the way she treated Sammy. Uncalled for it was. At it she was. She might have had no option, might have had to say all that stuff she came out with. She could at least have been civil, but at the very least, been bucking civil. Thank you very much.
A question for both of you. I'm curious about your experience with translation. I noticed that in your most recent collection, Roman, many different translators translating different stories, and I'm wondering what those relationships are like, how that works.
Thanks. It's not like that all the time, you know. It was just the case with that English book of mine. So normally I work just with one translator per book, and it's funny, you know, because a good translator can teach you a lot and can lighten up a bit those dark places you were not sure what were you trying to say, and also I think it's utmost scrutinizing, you know, to do it, to pass it all over again with someone with new pair of eyes. It's the closest reader you can get. So I really appreciate it. I really like the work. And it's funny thing is that in each, for example, each language sees the world differently. So when the translator who approaches you from another language could fix to a thing that doesn't bother another one, maybe a cultural reference, you know, maybe I don't know, Donal just read the piece of about Eastern Germany, Western Germany, you know, parts of history. So I think this part of the world, even though I haven't lived there and I haven't shared that experience, but it resonates, you know, so I can relate to it in many ways. On the contrary, if you let me know something about the Icelandic literature, or it might take me a larger effort to get into it. So probably it works other way around as well with translators.
So it's quite a close collaboration. A lot of the time,
almost lovers, you know. It's yeah.
And how about yourself?
I think I'm missing out on something almost lovers. How do I feel about the translation? I love it. I see it as a form of writing, actually. It's a great challenge. And I sometimes think the fact that there is a deadline is what helps you solve the challenges. You could sit at home scratching your head forever. And this is for me a difference between writing and translating. If you write short stories, you know, you'll submit them whenever. You don't find the agents and publishers queuing up for short stories necessarily. love them dearly. But when it comes to translations, it's the end of April or whatever, and it's great how that concentrates the mind. Sadly, a couple of my authors have died in recent years, but up until that point, I was only translating living writers, and I found that really helpful. It was great to know that you could fly over to Zurich or something, sit down, have a meal, and go through any questions that, no matter what you did, you hadn't found answers for. And I really have always enjoyed that part of the process. And what it's like to translate a dead author, it needs to be seen. And once you can work with our former editor and know that that person can answer those really difficult questions that you might have been dependent on the author for.
And Roman, would you read one of your stories for us?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for coming. It's first of all to say that. Thanks to Patrick, James, Elena, all the team. I was really these days enjoying the great authors and their stories. So thanks. Second thing is, like, please have mercy with my English, me and my English, because it's not happening too often that I read in English. So I just want to say something, something before the reading. When I started to write in Croatia, it was like the second half of the 90s. You were expected to write about the war, about the present, that very tense present that we lived back then. I couldn't do it. I didn't want to do it because I was scared. Actually, I was disgusted. I was repulsed by it. I didn't like what was happening, and so I started to write about different other things, other countries, and there were lots of reproaches in the media, in the reviews, saying, okay, it's fine, but why don't you write about this place and time? So, and I tried to figure out why was that happening, and then I realized that even though those stories were not taking place in Croatia, there was something that were unifying in them, and it was some kind of search for emotion, probably because I missed that part mostly, and back then, just to trust another person, just to trust that some kind of good relationship between people was possible. So then I discovered, I said, okay, I'm going to write about Croatia. I'm going to write about, not necessarily about war. I wouldn't protect my country. I wouldn't fight with a pen instead of a rifle. I was not interested in that. But I would try to investigate what was that something that I think we lost as society. And in each and every story that I wrote, and I think that I write, was I was trying to measure that, when tsunami happens, then two plates of earth, they confront underneath. So you end up 10 centimeters one way or another, and meanwhile, a lot of people got killed and died. So, and then after, when it's finished, you simply continue and to live as you used to know, the best you can. But it cannot hide the fact that you are living you pretend to live that normal life 10 centimeters. I wanted to write about those 10 centimeters, we don't see, but our society changed deeply. So what I realized is that it always has to do with some kind of spoiled love, that people cannot love each other the way they used to, or I had the impression they had, or so that capacity of loving was damaged. So I write quite slowly, and each collection of mine tells a story about certain aspect of my life or certain period of my life which is It can be about that loving things the way we love. And then the last book was about being a parent. You know, this was the last revolution I experienced, and the true revolution I experienced. It's not. So I was writing it, all aspects of being a father, or being a parent, or being a member of that team that is bringing a kid, a child up. And normally I would read a sad story, because more or less all of them are sad, but you are so kind of an audience, so I wouldn't like to make you cry, so I just decided to spare you, and I would read a shortened version of a story which is not that sad, so we can cry later on together, you know. But meanwhile, don't cry. For me, Argentina. It's called Two Children. I had 2 children, and I could not think. 2 children, from morning to night, from dusk till dawn. Behind them, not one stone left upon another. Scorched earth tappies, dust and ashes. 2 children, dark-haired angels, a boy and a girl. They were loved children, but no one mentioned this anymore. My wife least of all. She was a good woman, pretty, well-preserved, but she was fed up with it all. I'd say sometimes she even had regrets, deep regrets about all sorts of things. But at least she tried not to make it too obvious for me. Me, I couldn't hold back. I complained, thoughtlessly. 2 children. Sometimes I went too far, and she wasn't exactly full of understanding. To each of my groans, she retorted with a mutter, and my brain shrank after the pregnancy. It was her answer for everything. She'd found this piece of information in a book of a famous neurologist. She never finished the book, but what she had read was enough for the argument to end all our arguments. I presumed that this shrinkage wouldn't be permanent, but we never got to that part anyway. My wife would speak her sentences with a certain solemnity to them, finality even. They sounded like a verdict, and she seemed like a crippled homeland war veteran, as if she had lost something forever, but no longer cared or remembered what this something was. It was a guerrilla war, a fight for every inch of the territory. When I went out to take out the garbage or pay bills, she'd look at me with envy and say, "Lucky you, going out." Once, as I was getting ready for a funeral, a colleague from work had died. She whispered, almost in tears, "Please, can I go instead of you? I really need to go out among people." So desperate she was, or so smart, that wife of mine, love of my life. It's incredible what a bit of casual sex can do to a person, she'd tell her younger, less experienced sister over the phone. But we knew too well that we had no one to blame but ourselves. We loved each other, ended up on top of each other, snapped the condom, and made those 2 children. That much I could understand. But all this, that stuff that followed, no one could prepare you for that. To get my thoughts in gear, sometimes I'd smoke, nibble on seeds and nuts, or I just ran out and hop about outside our building. There were this always empty Chinese shop, Chia Ping Commerce, that's what it was called. And a puck-faced Chinese guy would peek out and say, "Hi Nate," I'd say back at him, and we'd smile at each other. On the surface of things, it was all there was to it. But these meetings empowered me. They testified to solidarity, helped me clear my head. But this too could not last. Soon I was plagued by the notion of a hidden meaning behind Chia Ping's laughter. This laughter coming from the world's most populous nation, belonging to the people who fought the surplus of children and shortage of thoughts for generations. There is something sinister about him, I complained to my wife. Chia Ping Commerce makes me ponder. But my wife, naturally, just shrugged it off and complained about the reduced capacities. It was Saturday, 11 p.m., and we could still hear giggles from the children's room. Then there was a scream and a heavy thud of something plastic hitting the party floor. No, definitely not. The last thing we needed was conversation about the Chinese. What we needed were incident-free weekends. And I can't say that these children were mean. They were merely well distributed. When the second was
born, the first one was 2. When the second turned 1, the other one was 3, and then 2, 4, 3, 5. A merciless logic. It was a scary prospect, but you couldn't escape it. And they weren't even that demanding, those children of ours. In fact, they required only the usual: to be fed, bathed, to have their clothes changed, to keep an eye on them, to break them up, to put them to sleep, to lull them, to sing to them, to talk to them, to negotiate, threaten, beat them, despair, get informed, take them to the daycare, take them out for a walk, put them in the car, strap them up in the seat, take them to the doctor. And how is one to contemplate them? How can one think at all? Chia Ping was just smiling. He was wise and he knew his business, even when it seemed there was no business at all. And our friends, yes, we also had friends. For some time now we have divided them in 2 groups, those with children and those without. Of course, this division was not without remainder. For example, we tended to see our friends with pets as a special kind of friends with children. And there were also a particular case of a couple of my wife's friends from college who grew bacterial culture in their fridge and made kefir from it. They considered it, the culture, a living thing. They talked to it every evening, they drained it and watered it with milk, and generally gave it more attention than some legitimate members of the first group devoted to their children. But friends without children, pets, or bacterial cultures were a different story. There were more than a few, a pure generational average, 35 years of age and a story to tell. Most often a story about specialization. One was a college professor and was specializing in scholarship. Another one had started a business and was specializing in making loads of money. And the third one was unemployed and was specializing in healthy living. They don't have kids. They can think, but I don't see they come up with anything clever, my wife used to say. She didn't like them, these friends of ours without children. They were living a modern life, more selfish than we could ever dream of being. To hell with them and their postcards from exotic countries, I could imagine her complain, as if we received any, which we didn't. And this made us ask, what do these people do on their travels when they are not writing postcards? How do they spend their time? Sometimes I had to ask myself if I was going to keep my wife. That's how exhausted we were. I know we loved each other, but we didn't travel, exercise, or have hobbies. We had children, 2 of them, and we were fed up with everything. We were looking for a way out, yes. That's how we were spending our time. And temporary relief would come in the shape of a friend of mine with 4 children, and a wife whose brain must have shrunk to the size of a pea. We visited each other and engaged in conversations that led nowhere. With 6 kids around us, it was impossible to think, let alone talk. We stopped wasting our breaths on complex sentences a long while ago. We only smiled at each other and exchanged glances filled with compassion. All of us, except my friend's wife. She simply had no strength left in her. We loved those friends although we knew next to nothing about them. Our socializing wouldn't sweep anyone off their feet. But when time came to say our goodbyes, I felt our mood improve. We were back in the saddle. Compared to what happened to those people, our 2 children no longer seemed like 2 great dependents. In general, back in those days, there were both rain and sun. The weather could turn at any moment. Once, for example, I found her crying, but I just quickly slipped away into the hall. I had no courage left for the tears. Still, with eavesdropping, I had no problems. From what I managed to make out, the news was a real bomb. Her sister, younger and so much less experienced until a short while ago, was pregnant, and my wife was comforting her. My brain had shrunk, she said. If I hadn't, I wouldn't be able to bear it. It sounded as if she was laughing, but then again, from where I was listening, she may as well have been crying. I haven't listened to a CD for ages. I haven't read a book, or danced, or did my fingernails. I'm embarrassed of how I look. Everything I cared about is so far now. I can only see it through the telescope. But when I see them sleep, or when I hear them breathe, or when I take in their smell, or when I put my arms around them, or when I just watch them grow and change, my heart is full. Yes, that's what she said. I heard it fine. Full. I don't know how else to say it. It seemed she was crying, but then again, from where I was listening, she could have just as easily been laughing. And that's it. Your life is empty, but your heart is full. That's what my wife said. She was a good wife, a generous and wise woman, and everything was all right with her brain. And even if it wasn't, I was convinced that soon everything would be just the way it had been before, together with everything else, everything we used to care about, and now we had to watch through the telescope. There was no way to be sure, but sometimes you just have to have faith. And for me, praying was never a problem. Never. Just as long I had something to pray for. This time, it was the four of us. My wife and I, and our two children. Sometimes I couldn't think. My life was empty, but my heart was full. At the end of the day, each day, call me crazy if you want, but I looked back and wanted it to last forever. Thanks.
So, both of you, like Roman, you're the artistic director of a short story festival. Donal, you're a translator. You're both of service to the short story community, short story writers, and you both have multiple collections. So what is it that keeps drawing you back in? What is it you love about the short story?
First, what I like about short story, there are several things I would bore you to death, but let's say on one side, I like that the diversity, the potential of a short form to capture the entire universe in just a few lines or a few pages in different ways. All the traditions, Anglo-American or European or language-based, plot-based, all kinds of stories that can deliver the story. And what I like, another thing that I like about the story and about the people who write it, is you don't write it to get rich, that's for sure. You don't write it because you want get yourself the famous publisher and get yourself a big fee for a contract. You write it because you love it, because you need to write it. This is a bit different. I must tell you, even though I work besides being the director of the festival, I work as an editor, and there are lots of good writers, and there are lots of good books. Some of those books, good or well-written books, are I could live without them. I really don't. Sometimes I think people write just to write, just to produce something, even without anything to say, Don't quote me on this back home impression. But I really think that that's something that story brings. It's not something that you put in your pocket, and the only richness is the very act you do, and this is to create, to share. I call story as a basic unit of human experience. We all share our stories, no matter which channel they come to us, or we send them along. And I really think it's something deeply humane. I don't know what you think about it. No.
Just stolen my thunder when Roman offered to go first. I was relieved because it's a big question, an obvious question, but I realised I had time to think, and what you said finally would have been on base my answer. When I had time to think, I realised that a version of my bio these days begins, Donal McLaughlin writes short stories and translates novels. And in a way that sums it up. And I enjoy translating those novels. There are stories within them, of course. But I guess as a reader, something really kicked in when I started reading the stories, short stories of Donal McLaughlin, or even the short novel Cal, for example, is 130 pages. Sold as a novel. Some people might say novella these days, it doesn't matter. But something really kicked in then. I was fortunate when I was about 2021. James Kelman, who had only published his first book at the time, second actually, but first in the UK, became the writer in residence in Paisley Central Library. And I was going along And I was studying at university at that time, quite caught up in that as well, final year of my BA and stuff like that. But Jim got me reading, and Jim kind of listened to my background, Derry and Catholic and so on, and it was he who directed me to the stories of Donal McLaughlin. And while I had been reading French literature and German literature at university, and it was very important and has been very important for my own writing and the themes and the stuff we heard about today, it was just something really special about discovering that someone so close to you, physically and so on, could write stories and publish stories in those ways. And part of my answer to this question is always, we tell each other stories, we don't tell each other novels. If you were opposite someone in a train that was telling you a novel, they'd change your seat, let's be honest about it, you know. So yeah, that human thing of sharing stories and telling stories, also writing them down and publishing them. Jim Kelman and others have shown this. Writing them down the way you hear them. I mean, I'm sorry, I have a Scottish accent these days because my family moved to Scotland when I was a child almost 50 years ago. My stories are actually written using the language I remember hearing in my grandmother's living room and stuff like that. I don't have the accent to deliver it accurately. But it's very, very important to me that you can end sentences with but, and that it's like and not like and stuff like that. And I think that kind of language, when people tell stories in that way, there's a great kind of warmth, humour, colour, humanity, etc. to it. And if you can get that down on the page in a story, that's great as well.
May I add something? You know, I always say, if you come to an event like this, if a novelist reads in front of you, she or he could always pick the best fragment, you know, and you would be enchanted. And the rest of the book could be one way or another. With story cannot fade. It's either it works, either it doesn't for you. So what I like is from the first line, the creation of the world, you know, and you would see it end, you know, in a couple of minutes, which is exciting, you know. Try to remember when's the last time when you saw or sensed the world being born and ending in those. For me, it's a kind of mystery because you have to reduce. And what I like about short story also is silence. You know, it doesn't work just like with lines. What counts is that it is like if you imagine a breath. You know, this is the story for me is that space between two breaths. You know, it brings you life, it keeps you alive. It's so human, it's so natural, and but then it's limited and it lives of all what surrounds it. This is how I feel.
Maybe another kind of big, expansive question. We did well with the last one. I'm curious about pacing. You know, your dialogue especially is incredibly sharp and snappy, and I know when I mentioned that kind of momentum, I feel that kind of it's that kind of rushing forward. Your stories have that kind of energy, and just not being a prose writer myself, I wonder, is that something you're thinking about as you're writing, or no?
I like to think that these things happen intuitively. You know, I don't really sit down and think about pace or whatever. But you know, you've listened to, if you're Irish especially, you've listened to good stories being told in your grand's living room and pub, etc. all your life, and you're probably aware of pace and the impact of good lines and stuff like that way. And for me, these are very natural things. When it comes to the editing stage, I'm often aware, with this book in particular, it was finished, and I had the good fortune to get a residency in upstate New York. And I went there, the book was basically finished, I was reading, I think I'd done what I thought was the final edit on the first of the two stories, was going to read through the second one and move on to another project while in America. But sitting there, something was just telling me, some of this you could take it back a bit further. And I hadn't seen how to do it at home, but sitting, looking at gear in a sculpture park and things like that, out of the back of the house where the residency was, I did find ways just of thinning down each paragraph and therefore moving on a bit more. And someone who read it, a writer friend of mine who read it soon afterwards, he talked about how the story. He was reading the first story when he wrote the first email, and he said it was really bouncing along. And I realised it wasn't bouncing along before I went to America, but yeah, it's moving along now. So you can work and still manage to invest more and improve it.
Do you have any thoughts on the pacing or movement, or is that an editing for you, or is that?
No, I agree with Donal. I think it's something. Of course, you could, before the very act of writing, you could have an idea what kind of story would you like to go for. But what I believe is that whichever way you try, you end up being yourself. You can alter this. Many of the stories I write are stylistically they are different. But I think there is something that unifies them. What I like is, for example, when you think about poetry, short story and a novel, I would always say that short story is more akin of poetry than to a novel, even though those are prose forms. What I feel is that those two forms, poetry and short story, share is that rhythmical and the focus on language and rhythm. And so this is my take. Some other authors can feel it and would probably feel differently, but what you asked me, so I revealed you almost my darkest secret.
Could I maybe just add that I feel that without the kind of music and rhythm that you're talking about, I couldn't write. And it's one reason I use forms of English which are maybe more Northern Irish and Scottish in my own writing. And I often say I couldn't write in standard English. That somehow would be more of a challenge for me. Billy O'Callaghan, who was floating around earlier, he introduced me at the World Book Festival here a couple of years ago, and he commented, I came to Cork to realise this and to hear this. He said that the music in my stories is set in stone. And I think I know what he means. If you read them aloud, you can only read it that way and no other way, because of the rhythm of the phrases and natural everyday speech and so on. And that for me carries the story, or carries the text. And I guess when I'm translating, I'm looking for some kind of equivalent music, trying to achieve that in the translations as well. Though normally I translate from standard German into standard English.